Security. Diane Harwell didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. That single word cut across the marble floor of the Grand Meridian like a blade. Get this man out of my meeting before I call the police. The man she was pointing at hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done a single thing wrong. He had simply walked across the lobby, stopped in front of her, and extended his hand. Ms. Harwell, Elijah Okafor, we have a 9 o'clock. She looked at his hand. Then she looked at him, at the plain gray shirt, at the simple shoes, at the leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She made her decision in under 3 seconds. I don't know who let you in here, she said, but this is a private meeting, for serious people. My office confirmed this meeting 3 weeks ago, Elijah said. His voice was calm, steady, like a man who had been here before, in different lobbies, with different faces, same script. You're welcome to call your assistant. I don't need to call anyone. Diane's voice climbed just enough so that the 2 European investors standing beside her could hear every word. She wanted them to hear. She wanted them to see. People who belong in rooms like this don't show up looking like they wandered in off the street. There may be some confusion, Elijah said. There's no confusion. She stepped back, one small step, the way a person steps away from something unclean. I don't do business with people who lie their way into my meetings. She turned toward the security desk and lifted one manicured hand as though she had spotted a thief. Jerome was the one who came. Older man, gray at his temples. His face showed plainly how little he wanted any part of this. He'd been working hotel security for 22 years. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before. He just didn't have a choice. This man is disrupting a private meeting. Diane pointed at Elijah the way a person points at litter on the ground. He's not on any list. I want him removed from the building. Elijah looked at Jerome. There's no need for an escort, he said quietly. I can find my own way out. Oh, he'll be escorted. Diane's voice had gone cold, certain. The voice of a woman who had never once questioned her right to give an order. Walk him all the way to the street. I don't want him wandering into some other meeting. The walk across that lobby was long. Every eye in the room followed Elijah Okafor. A woman near the elevator held her phone up. Not secretly, openly. The camera catching every step. Elijah kept his head level, his steps unhurried. At the glass doors, Jerome leaned in close. I'm sorry about this, sir, he said, voice low, almost a whisper. I'm just doing my job. Elijah looked at him, not with anger, not with pity. I know, he said. It's not you. Then he was outside. The morning air hit him cold and sharp. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, letting his heartbeat settle back to where it belonged. That old familiar weight was back in his chest, the one he'd carried in classrooms and boardrooms and restaurants his whole life, the weight of being decided about before he had said a single word. His phone buzzed. Amara. He answered it, looking back through the glass one last time. Diane was already laughing again with her guests, already smoothing her sleeve, already moving on, like she had brushed away something distasteful and returned to the important business of being important. How did it go? Amara asked. Cancel the rest of my day, Elijah said. Book me on the first flight home. A pause. What about the 9 months of work, the 500 million? I just got my answer, Elijah said. It took about 3 minutes. Behind the glass, Diane Harwell turned back to her guests with a bright, recovering smile. She had no idea. The man she had just removed like a piece of furniture ran a fund worth $2.3 billion. He had studied her dying company for 9 months and come to believe in what it could be. He was the only investor left on Earth still willing to open that door. Her company had 11 weeks of cash remaining, and she had just spent 3 minutes slamming that door shut in front of 50 witnesses with a phone recording every second. To understand what Diane Harwell destroyed in those 3 minutes, we need to go back. Not to that morning, not to the lobby, further than that. We need to go back to where both of them began. Elijah Okafor grew up on the south side of Chicago, the part of the city that people like Diane saw only through a car window on the way to somewhere better. His mother worked 3 jobs, She got up before the sun and came home after dark, and she never complained. Not once. Not where Elijah could hear her. He did his homework at a kitchen table under a flickering light. He earned a scholarship nobody expected him to earn. He built something slowly from nothing. Something so valuable that the largest banks in the country had lined up to buy it. He said no to all of them. He wanted to build it his way, on his terms, for the people his industry kept forgetting. Now he ran a fund that managed $2.3 billion. He sat on boards whose names people said with respect. He had more power in a room than most people ever see in a lifetime. But here was the thing nobody understood about Elijah Okafor until it was too late. He had a rule. He never wore a suit to a first meeting. Plain shirt, dark trousers, simple shoes, every single time. He had talked about it in interviews. He had written about it. Forbes had published it. The Wall Street Journal had asked him to explain it twice. Anyone in his world who paid attention knew exactly why. "I want to know who respects the idea," he had said, "and who only respects the wallet." It was a filter, a simple one. The ones who saw past the plain shirt were the only ones worth working with. The ones who didn't showed him in the first 3 seconds exactly how they treated anyone they had decided was beneath them. Diane Harwell had read none of that, because she never read the briefs her assistant prepared. That was what assistants were for. She had glanced at the line on her calendar that said 9 o'clock investor and assumed the investor would arrive grateful for the audience. She had assumed right her whole life. She had no reason to think this morning would be different. Now, let's talk about the company she was trying to save. Harwell Technologies had been worth $800 million not 2 years earlier. A mid-sized company with genuinely good technology at its core. Real innovation. The kind of thing that could matter if it survived long enough to reach the market. It was not surviving. The company burned through $9.4 million every single month. The account on Roland Vance's spreadsheet held enough to last 11 more weeks. After that, there was a word Diane could not bring herself to say, even alone in the dark. She had pitched 24 investors in 8 months. 24 had said no. Some politely, some not. She had burned through every relationship, every introduction, every warm call. The list had one name left on it. That name was Elijah Okafor. He had reached out to her team 6 months ago. Her CFO, Roland, had spent those months in quiet back and forth with Elijah's advisors, building trust, sharing data, working toward this morning. Elijah had flown across the country to sit down with her. He had believed in the technology. 9 months of research had told him it was real. What he did not yet know was whether the person running it was someone worth believing in. He had his answer now. He got it in 3 minutes. And Diane Harwell, standing in the center of a marble lobby she had never once questioned her right to occupy, did not yet know that the most important 3 minutes of her professional life had already happened. She thought she had just handled a situation. She had just created the worst one of her life. 6:30 in the morning. Elijah Okafor sat in his hotel room with the Harwell Technologies file open in front of him. He had read it so many times he could recite it, but he read it again anyway. That was how he worked. That was how he had always worked. You showed up knowing more than anyone expected you to know. You showed up more prepared than the room required. You made yourself undeniable long before you walked through the door. The technology was real. That was the thing he kept coming back to. 3 engineers at Harwell had built something genuinely new. A processing architecture that solved a problem the industry had been pretending wasn't a problem for almost a decade. Elijah had had it reviewed by 4 independent technical teams. All 4 said the same thing. This works. This matters. If someone keeps the lights on long enough, this changes how the industry operates. He closed the folder. The question was never the technology. The question was the person running the company. His phone rang. Amara Cole, his chief advisor, the person who had been with him since the fund's first year when they were operating out of a shared office the size of a closet. "You sure about this one?" she asked. "She hasn't read the brief." Elijah paused. How do you know? Because her assistant called my assistant to ask what you look like. A beat. They wanted to know if you'd be wearing a suit. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled. That's exactly why I'm going, he said. He ordered coffee from room service, sat by the window, looked at the city waking up below him. Chicago was home. This was not Chicago. This was a city that had made Diane Harwell feel like the center of every room she walked into, and she had spent 43 years believing it. He understood that kind of certainty. He had seen it his whole life. In the faces of people who had never been made to question whether they belonged. He picked up his gray shirt. 37 floors above him and across town, Diane Harwell was also getting ready. 7:15 in the morning. Her office, 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out at the bay like it was a possession, like the view belonged to her because the office did. Priya Suresh, her assistant, knocked and entered carrying a leather folder. The Okafor brief, Ms. Harwell. She set it on the corner of the desk. Background fund history investment philosophy and the technical review he commissioned on our core architecture. Diane glanced at it without picking it up. I'll look at it in the meeting. Priya paused at the door. She had been Diane's assistant for 4 years. She knew better than to push. Of course, she said, and left. Roland Vance came in 3 minutes later. Roland was the CFO. Careful man, precise. The kind of person who knew every number in the building and carried the weight of them quietly. He sat down across from Diane and put a folder on the desk. 11 weeks, he said, flat, no softening. I know what the number is, Roland. Okafor Capital is the last option. Every other door is closed. He looked at her steadily. This morning matters more than any meeting we've had in 2 years. I've done 300 investor pitches in my career, Diane said. Her voice was even, certain. The voice she used when she wanted a room to stop worrying. I know how to read a room. Roland picked up the brief from the corner of her desk. He placed it directly in front of her, not to the side, directly in front. He has a well-documented philosophy about first meetings, Roland said. It's worth reading before... Roland? She met his eyes. I'm fine. He left the brief where he had placed it. He left the room. Diane looked at the brief for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her window. The bay was still out there. The city was still hers. She had 11 weeks of crisis and a 9 o'clock meeting, and she did not need to read a document to know how to walk into a room. She was Diane Harwell. She always knew how to walk into a room. 8:55 in the morning. She stepped into the lobby of the Grand Meridian. Klaus Weber and his associate were already there. The lobby was gold and marble, and exactly the kind of room she had built her life inside. She started performing. The bright laugh, the warm handshake, the certainty that she belonged at the center. She had practiced this so many times it had stopped feeling like performance. It felt like truth. 5 minutes later, the glass doors across the lobby slid open, and Elijah Okafor walked in out of the cold, bright morning. He was carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He was wearing a plain gray shirt. Let's go back to that lobby one more time. Slower this time. Because what happened in those 3 minutes deserves to be understood. Not just what was said, but what was happening underneath every word. Elijah crossed the marble floor toward Diane. His steps were even. His face was open. He extended his hand the way a person extends their hand when they are simply meeting another person and expecting to be met. He was not nervous. He was not performing. He was not asking for anything. He was just there. Diane looked at his outstretched hand, and something in her face closed. Fast, almost invisible. The way a door swings shut before you can get your foot in. She stepped back, half a step. Small enough that someone not watching carefully might not have noticed. But Elijah noticed. He always noticed. He had been noticing that particular half step his entire life. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice already sharpening, already climbing. Who let you in here exactly? There may be some confusion, he said. His hand was still out, still warm, still patient. My office confirmed this meeting 3 weeks ago. This is a private meeting. Her voice went up, loud enough now for Klaus Weber and his associate to hear clearly. She wanted them to hear. She wanted them to see her handling the situation. For serious investors, not for people who wander in off the street thinking they can talk their way into a room like this. She looked him up and down, slow, deliberate, making certain everyone in the lobby saw her do it. People like you. 3 words. She let them hang in the air. Klaus Weber shifted. He said something under his breath to Diane, something about letting the man speak. Diane raised one finger without looking at him. Just one finger. A small thing, but it said everything. The investors were furniture right now. She was the only person in this lobby who mattered. I'm a managing partner at Okafor Capital, Elijah said. His voice had not changed, still low, still steady, still the kind of calm that should have warned her. My firm manages over $2 billion. We've been in contact with your CFO for months. Diane laughed. An ugly sound, a dismissive, certain sound. Of course you are, she said. And next you'll tell me you sit on the board at Apple. She was already turning toward the security desk. Jerome came. That older man, gray at his temples. He had heard the exchange from 15 feet away. His face was a careful blank, the kind of blank that only happens when a person is holding something difficult very tightly behind their eyes. Walk him all the way to the street, Diane said. I don't want him slipping into some other meeting. The walk was long. The lobby was quiet. Not silent, just the particular quiet that happens when a room full of people is watching something they know is wrong and no one is moving to stop it. At the glass doors, Jerome leaned close and apologized. Elijah said it wasn't him. Then he was outside in the cold. Inside, Diane turned back to Klaus Weber and his associate with a recovering smile. I'm so sorry about that, she said. You would not believe how many people try to walk into meetings like this. You have to be firm. Klaus Weber did not smile back. Vivian, he said, then caught himself and corrected it. Diane, that seemed rather harsh. You have to be firm with people like that, she said, waving it away. Otherwise, they think they can waste your time. The 2 men exchanged a look she did not catch. Then Klaus said, We have a flight, and in any case, we told you no last week. We only came by to be polite. They shook her hand quickly and left her standing alone. In the center of the golden lobby, she had always been so certain belonged to her. She had 11 weeks of money left. 24 investors had already walked away, and she had just spent 3 minutes throwing out the only man willing to save everything she had spent her life building. Here is what she did not know yet. The man she had pointed at like litter in that lobby was already on a sidewalk outside calling his advisor, already canceling his day, already booking the next flight home. And in less than 3 hours, Diane Harwell was going to find out exactly who Elijah Okafor was. And the learning was going to cost her more than she had ever paid for anything in her life. Not just money, not just the title on her door, something deeper than that. Something she had never once been made to put down. If you have ever been sized up and dismissed before you said a single word, if you have ever watched someone else walk through a door that was closed in your face, stay with this one. Subscribe to our channel. Because what comes next is going to change the way you look at every room you walk into. 10:30 in the morning. Diane Harwell stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor and walked down the hallway toward her office like nothing had happened. Because as far as she was concerned, nothing had. The lobby was handled. The situation was resolved. The man in the gray shirt was gone, and the important meeting that was going to save her company was still ahead of her. Rescheduled. Better prepared. The right people in the right room with the right energy. That was how she thought about it. That was how she had always thought about things that didn't go the way she expected. You handled them. You moved on. You didn't carry them around with you like they meant something. Her office was exactly as she'd left it 2 hours ago. The nameplate on the door, polished, heavy. The kind of nameplate that said the person behind this door had arrived and intended to stay. floor-to-ceiling windows showing the bay going gray-blue and vast in the late morning light. A desk the size of a dining table with nothing on it that wasn't necessary. Diane set her bag down and stood at the window for a moment. The bay looked the same. The city looked the same. She was fine. Roland Vance knocked and entered without quite waiting to be told. He sat down across from her without being invited. That alone was unusual enough to make her look up. He had a folder in his hand, and his face was flat in the way it got when he was holding something difficult together. "How did it go?" he asked. "We had a small issue in the lobby. Handled. I'm looking at rescheduling." Roland said nothing for a moment. He looked at the folder in his hands. "What kind of issue?" "Someone showed up dressed like he was going to a barbecue, claimed to be our 9 o'clock. She sat down and opened her laptop. "Security walked him out. We'll find a new time." Roland was very still. "Diane," his voice was careful, measured. "What was this person's name?" "I didn't ask." She started typing. "Priya can pull the calendar and—" "Was it Elijah Okafor?" Her fingers stopped on the keyboard. She didn't look up right away. Something in Roland's voice had shifted. Something underneath the careful surface. Not panic. Something quieter than panic. Something that made her not want to look at his face. "He said something about a fund," she said. "Very creative story. I've seen that pitch before. Someone tries to walk into a serious room, makes up an impressive background." "Diane." Now she looked up. Roland put the folder on her desk. He opened it. Inside was a printout, a magazine profile, full photograph, one full page. The man from the lobby in the same gray shirt she had sneered at in a portrait that had been seen by more people than Diane would meet in a lifetime. She read the name under the photo. Elijah Okafor, managing partner, Okafor Capital. She let her eyes go to the numbers. They didn't make sense at first. Her brain rejected them the way a body rejects something foreign. Then they snapped into a terrible, cold sharpness. Fund value, $2.3 billion. Board seats. The names of companies she had spent her career wanting to be associated with. Forbes, the Journal. 3 profiles in the last 18 months. And there, near the bottom of the profile, in a pull quote set in large type, the words that hit her like a physical thing. "I dress simply on purpose. I want to know who respects the idea and who only respects the wallet." The room felt different. She sat very still. She thought about the man who had extended his hand in the lobby, the calm that had filled the space around him rather than demanding it, the way he had not flinched when she stepped back, the way he had not raised his voice when she called security, the way Jerome had said, "I'm sorry, sir," like he meant it. She thought about 3 minutes. 3 minutes was how long it had taken. She picked up her phone with hands that were not entirely steady and dialed the number from the brief. It rang once. Then voicemail. His voice, that same calm voice, unhurried. She left a message, careful words, the language of misunderstanding and scheduling errors and warmest regards. She hit send on an email with the same careful language. Then she sat in the office that had always been hers and felt the floor of it beginning very slightly to give way. Roland was still in the doorway. "He's famous for it," Roland said. "The plain shirt. He wrote about it in the journal. Everyone in our world knows." He paused. "He didn't wander in off the street, Diane. He flew across the country. He believed in our technology. He was the last open door." The word was past tense. "Can we fix it?" Diane asked. Roland looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. "I don't know," he said. And the fact that Roland Vance, who always knew, was saying, "I don't know," in that quiet, careful way, was its own kind of answer. Priya knocked at 11:15. She entered the office the way she always entered, efficient, measured, prepared for whatever the room required. But today, something was different about her. Her face had gone the color of paper. She was holding her iPad the way a person holds something they don't want to be holding but cannot put down. "Ms. Harwell," she said, "I need to ask you about the man from the lobby." Diane had her phone in her hand, waiting for a callback that was not coming. "Already handled," she said without looking up. "There's something you need to see." Priya crossed the room and placed the iPad on the desk directly in front of Diane. Not to the side, not at an angle, directly in her line of sight. The screen was open to a Forbes digital profile with a full-width photograph at the top. The man in the photograph was wearing a plain gray shirt. Diane looked at the photograph, then at the headline, then at the numbers. The numbers didn't match what she had decided about that man in under 3 seconds in the lobby. They didn't match anything she had assumed about gray shirts and simple shoes. They were numbers from a different world than the world she had spent her whole life building and protecting and standing at the center of. "Tell me this is a different man," Diane said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "It's not," Priya said. She reached over gently and scrolled down. More photographs. Elijah beside people whose faces everyone recognized. Elijah on a stage at a conference in the mountains where the powerful of the world gathered every winter. In every single one he was dressed the same way. Plain, simple, on purpose. "The meeting was confirmed 3 weeks ago," Priya said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I have the emails. He flew here specifically. The investment on the table was $500 million. She stopped. Let that number land. "I've been communicating with his team for months, Miss Harwell. Roland has been communicating with his team for months." 500 million. The number hit Diane in the chest like something struck, because 500 million was not just a number. It was 11 weeks becoming a future. It was the word she could not say in the privacy of her own mind, becoming unsayable again. It was 3,200 people keeping their jobs. It was the technology her engineers had built, the thing she had given a decade of her life to, surviving long enough to matter. And she had thrown it out of a hotel lobby. She had pointed at it like litter. She stood so fast her chair rolled back and struck the window. She didn't notice. She dialed Elijah's number again. Voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. The second email she wrote was longer than the first. The careful language of a scheduling mix-up started to fray at the edges. A little more of the truth was trying to get through. But not enough. Not yet. She was still trying to frame it in a way that made it look smaller than it was. She hit send. The sound it made felt unbearably final. Roland appeared at the door again. He had his own phone in his hand. His face had moved from careful to something she had never seen on Roland's face before. "Reinhardt posted something," he said. "Klaus Weber, the German investor from the lobby." He had said nothing while it was happening, but he had been watching. Diane took Roland's phone. The LinkedIn post was short. It named no one. But it did not need to. It described witnessing a shocking display of unprofessionalism at a meeting that morning. It said that how a person treated others said everything about who they were. It said that some of what passed for leadership in certain corners of this industry would not survive the light. It had already been shared 412 times. While Diane watched the number climb, her phone rang in her other hand. Not Elijah. Arthur Neville, chairman of her board. She answered. "Tell me it isn't true." His voice was winter. The kind of cold that has no emotion in it because the emotion has already been decided. "Tell me you didn't have a man removed from a building this morning. Tell me that man wasn't Elijah Okafor." "Arthur, I can explain. Do you understand what you've done?" He didn't wait for an answer. "We need $500 million. Okafor was the last door still open to us. And you slammed it. In public, on camera, in front of witnesses. On the one man in this entire industry who has publicly stated he never offers a second chance to people who show him who they are." The line went dead. Diane stood in the middle of her beautiful corner office on the 42nd floor with a dead phone in each hand and the bay stretching out blue and indifferent beyond her windows. She thought about what Arthur had said. On camera. She looked at Priya. "There's video?" she asked. Priya nodded once very carefully. Diane sat down slowly. She put both phones on the desk. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked at the surface of her desk the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand by staring at it long enough. The brief sat where Roland had placed it 2 hours ago. The brief she had never picked up. The brief that would have taken 12 minutes to read and would have told her everything. It was still there. 12 o'clock. No call back from Elijah. 12:30. Nothing. 1 in the afternoon. Diane's phone had stopped being a device she was waiting on and had become a thing she was afraid of. It rang constantly now, but not the right voice. Board members, her public relations firm, a number she didn't recognize that called 3 times in a row until she blocked it and then called from a different number. Denise Park. She knew that name. Journalist. Business desk. The kind of reporter who found things out before they were ready to be found. Diane did not answer any of them. She wrote a third email to Elijah. This one had less careful language than the others. The pretense of the scheduling misunderstanding was almost gone. What was left underneath it was closer to the truth, but still not quite all the way there. She was still looking for a frame, a way of saying what she had done that made it smaller, more manageable, more survivable. She sent it. She stared at her screen. Roland came back at 1:45. He stood in the doorway, and this time he did not sit down, and he did not try to make his face blank. He let her see what was in it. The video was on Twitter, he said. She looked at him. How many views? As of 10 minutes ago. He paused. 1.4 million. She closed her eyes. She opened them. Play it, she said. Roland turned his phone toward her. The video was 47 seconds long, shot from behind a pillar angle slightly upward, the kind of footage that catches everything without being obvious about it. You could see Diane's face clearly. You could see her stepping back. You could see her raised hand summoning security. You could see Elijah's stillness, his dignity. You could see Jerome's face. That was the thing that hit her hardest. Jerome. Old man, gray temples. His face while he was walking Elijah toward the door. The way his eyes were looking straight ahead because looking anywhere else would have required feeling something he couldn't afford to feel on the clock. She had done that to Jerome, too. She handed Roland's phone back to him. What are people saying? She asked. Roland looked at the phone. The comment that has the most likes right now says, he stopped. Tell me. He read it to her quietly. The comment said that this was not a surprise, that this was what power had always looked like for people who moved through the world the way Elijah Okafor moved through it. That what was surprising was that it was finally being seen. 3,800 likes. Climbing. Diane nodded once. Arthur Neville called again at 2:15. This time she answered. The board is convening an emergency session tonight, Arthur said. You don't need to attend. She understood what that meant. Arthur, I have nothing else to say to you right now, Diane. He hung up. She tried Elijah again, 4th time. The voicemail picked up, and this time she couldn't speak at all. She sat with the phone against her ear, listening to the small electronic silence after the beep, and then she hung up and set the phone on the desk and did not touch it for a long time. Roland was still there. He sat down this time, not across the desk, in the chair beside it. Next to her, rather than opposite her. She noticed that. She didn't know what to do with it. What did you think when I told him to leave? She asked. Roland looked at the window. A long pause. I thought about walking out, he said. I didn't. I'm not sure what that says about me. Another pause. He had flown here specifically. He had spent 9 months studying this company. He believed in what the engineers built, even when the people running the company didn't have the numbers to back it up. Roland turned to look at her. He came here with real belief, Diane. In us. In the work. And in 3 minutes you turned that into something else. I didn't know who he was. I know. If I had known. I know. Roland's voice was quiet, even, without judgment, which was somehow worse than if it had judgment in it. But that's the part that isn't really the problem. The problem isn't that you didn't know who he was. The The problem is what you decided about him before you knew anything about him at all. She looked at him. He looked back. I've worked for you for 7 years, he said. I've watched you walk into 1,000 rooms. You read people fast, faster than anyone I've ever seen. But there's one read you make before you have any information at all, and it's always the same read, and today it cost us everything. He stood up. Get some sleep tonight, he said. The board session will go on without you. Whatever comes next starts in the morning. He left. Diane Harwell sat alone in her corner office with the bay behind her and the phones lighting up and the number 1.4 million climbing somewhere on a screen she could no longer look at. She opened her laptop. She went to the Forbes profile, and she began to read about the man she had pointed at like litter. She had expected to find a biography. She found something closer to a mirror. Not the kind you look into in the morning when you're performing the version of yourself the world requires. The other kind. The kind that shows you what is actually there. The first piece was a long profile from 2 years ago. The writer had spent 3 days with Elijah, following him through meetings in New York, Chicago, 2 cities in between. The article had 17 photographs. In all 17, he was dressed simply. Always the same. Always on purpose. He had talked about growing up on the South Side in a way that didn't perform the difficulty of it, but also didn't hide it. He talked about his mother, the way people talk about someone who shaped the whole architecture of who they became. 3 jobs, no complaints. Standards so high they were quiet rather than loud, because that was the only way they could be maintained. He talked about the scholarship, about arriving at a university that had more money in its endowment than his entire neighborhood would see in a generation, about learning very quickly that the rooms he was walking into had been designed over a very long time with a very particular kind of person in mind, and about deciding not to let that design stop him. Then there was the line about the shirt. Diane read it 3 times. I want to know who respects the idea and who only respects the wallet. The plain shirt is a filter. The ones who can see past it are the ones worth working with. The ones who can't show me in the first 3 seconds exactly how they treat anyone they've decided is beneath them. That information is worth more than any pitch deck. She put her hand over her mouth. She read it again. She had not just failed a filter. She had been the filter's entire purpose. She had been the thing the filter was designed to find, and she had arrived at exactly the wrong time in exactly the wrong frame of mind, and she had performed precisely the behavior that 9 months of careful, patient work had been quietly testing for. She scrolled. There was an interview from 4 years earlier, shorter, more direct. He had been asked about the challenges of moving through his particular world as a black man who did not fit the image that world had decided belonged in it. He hadn't performed pain about it, hadn't made it dramatic. He had spoken about it with the flat, factual precision of someone describing weather. The worst kind of prejudice isn't the loud, obvious kind, he said. It's the 1,000 quiet moments where someone decides you don't belong before you've opened your mouth. Based on clothes, based on neighborhood, based on something they absorbed before they ever examined it. Most of those moments never get recorded. Most of them just get absorbed and added to the weight. Diane read that line and felt something go still inside her. She had been one of those moments. She had walked into it with her eyes open and her certainty intact. She had not examined anything. She had decided in under 3 seconds, and the decision had come from somewhere so deep and so built in that she hadn't even felt herself make it. She kept scrolling. There was a more recent interview from 6 months ago. He had talked about the plain shirt specifically, about why he still did it even after everything, about what it kept teaching him. I've been mistaken for the help more times than I can count, he said. Kitchen staff, drivers, security, maintenance. I've been handed brooms. I've been asked to clear plates. I've been told the elevator for staff is around the back. He hadn't said this with bitterness. He had said it like a man reporting facts. Each time I learned something true about the person making the mistake. True things, useful things, things you cannot learn any other way. Diane sat with that for a long time. She knew now exactly what he had learned about her. She closed the laptop and put her face in her hands. The office was quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when the city outside is still going, but the inside of a particular life has stopped for a moment. She had been here 43 years. She had been called exceptional for 43 years. She had built this company from a concept and a team of 12 engineers and a belief that the technology was real and the market would eventually agree. She had fought for every floor of this building, every meeting, every dollar, and then she had walked into a marble lobby at 8:55 on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and in 3 minutes she had undone the most important of all of it, because she had looked at a man in a gray shirt and decided the gray shirt was the whole of what he was. Not a mistake. That was what she kept coming back to. A mistake was a hectic morning. A mistake was a crossed calendar. A mistake was a misread name on a list. This was not a mistake. This had come from somewhere. Something built up over a very long time by a very particular way of moving through the world. The certainty that some people belonged and some people didn't, and that she had always been the one who got to decide which was which. She had never had to examine it because it had never cost her anything. Until today. She looked at the window. The bay was still out there, blue and vast and completely indifferent to what she had done. She picked up her phone and opened her Maps application. She typed an address she already knew, Okafor Capital, Chicago, Illinois. She looked at the route. She looked at the distance. She looked at the time. Then she opened the airline application. First flight out, 5:45 in the morning. She booked it. She did not know if it would matter. She did not know if he would see her. She did not know if anything she could say would be enough, or right, or real, or worth the flight. But she knew that the brief she had never read was still sitting on her desk, and she picked it up, and she started reading. The number was 2.1 million by 4 in the afternoon. Priya came in with the tablet, and Diane did not tell her to put it down. She looked at the screen. She watched herself for the first time from the outside. 47 seconds. She had known intellectually that someone had been recording. But knowing something intellectually and seeing yourself on a screen from someone else's angle are two entirely different experiences. She watched herself step back. That half step. From outside, it looked different than it had felt from inside. From inside, it had felt like practical sense, appropriate caution about a person who had no business in that lobby. From outside, it looked like exactly what it was. She watched herself raise one hand and summon security the way you would summon someone to clear a glass off a table. She watched Elijah lower his outstretched hand. She watched his face during the walk. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at the ceiling. He walked the way a person walks when they have been in this particular kind of room their entire life, and they have decided a long time ago that this room does not get to take anything from them that they don't choose to give it. The video ended with Diane turning back to Klaus Weber and his associate with a bright, recovering smile. The smile looked different on screen. It looked like a woman who had just done a small piece of housekeeping and was getting back to the real business of the day. She handed the tablet back to Priya. "How many comments?" she asked. "Over 40,000, Priya said quietly. "Most of them." She stopped. "I understand," Diane said. "Thank you, Priya." When Priya left, Diane called Denise Park, the journalist who had been calling all afternoon. Not because she had an answer, not because she had a statement, but because the alternative was continuing to pretend that not answering was a strategy rather than a surrender. Denise Park answered on the first ring. "Ms. Harwell," she said, not warmly, professionally. The warmth of a journalist is always somewhere behind a door. "I'm not prepared to make a statement yet," Diane said. "Would you be willing to speak on background?" "No." "Would you be willing to speak on the record tomorrow morning before we publish?" A pause. "What is the story?" Diane asked. "The story is what it is," Denise said. "But you have an opportunity to be part of how it's told." Diane thought about that. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said. She hung up. Then Arthur Neville texted. 4 words. "Board session concluded. Call me." She stared at those 4 words for a long time. She called. "It's done," Arthur said. No preamble, no warmth. "Emergency session, 2 hours, unanimous." "What's the decision?" she asked. "We're not prepared to remove you tonight. There are processes that need to be followed. But Diane," he stopped. "You need to understand that this conversation is about what follows tonight, not what preceded it. Tonight was just the beginning." "I understand." "I don't think you do yet." His voice had lost all its winter edge. What was left was something quieter and somehow harder to hear. "You've been building this for 20 years. What happened in that lobby this morning was 47 seconds. And those 47 seconds are going to be what defines this company's story going forward, unless you make a very different kind of decision than you made this morning." A pause. "Think hard about what that different decision looks like." He hung up. The office was very quiet. Diane picked up the brief again, the one she had not read this morning. She had been reading it for the past 2 hours in pieces between phone calls and emails, and the particular work of watching your professional life begin to change shape around you. There was a section near the back she had not reached yet. Investment philosophy. She turned to it. The last paragraph. He had written it himself, she realized, not a ghostwriter. The cadence was too plain, too direct. "I invest in people first, technology second, numbers third. Because the numbers can be right, and the technology can be brilliant, and the opportunity can be real. And if the person running it cannot see past their own assumptions to the human being standing in front of them, none of the rest of it matters enough. I have walked away from perfect deals because of a single moment in a lobby. I have done this more than once. I expect to do it again." She put the brief down. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the window. She picked up her phone and opened the airline app again. First flight out. Chicago, 5:45 in the morning. She had booked it 2 hours ago. She had not yet unpacked it. She left it booked. Roland Vance came back at 5:30. He knocked once and entered. He sat down in the chair beside the desk. Not across it, beside it. The same place he had chosen earlier. Diane noticed he kept choosing that particular chair and that it felt different from the chair across the desk in a way she couldn't entirely name. He didn't have a folder this time. He didn't have a phone. He had nothing in his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Not as your CFO, just as someone who has been in this building for 7 years." She looked at him. "Say it," she said. Roland looked at the window for a moment, then he looked at her. "I've watched you do 300 investor meetings," he said. "I've watched you walk into rooms where people underestimated you and come out having changed every assumption in that room. I have watched you be brilliant at this for 7 years." He stopped. "This morning I watched you read someone in 3 seconds and act on what you read without checking yourself once. I didn't know who he was. I know. If I had read the brief, Diane..." His voice was not unkind. That was the part that made it land harder. "You didn't read the brief because you decided before you sat down that it didn't matter. The same way you decided in the lobby that he didn't matter. The brief and the man in the lobby were the same decision. You made it before you had any information at all. And the reason you made it without any information is the part we need to talk about." She was quiet. 7 years, Roland said. "I've noticed things. I've said nothing. I told myself it was above my station. I told myself someone else would address it. I told myself the company was doing well enough that the cost wasn't visible yet." He paused. "Today the cost became very visible." "What things?" He looked at her steadily. "The interviews where candidates who looked like Elijah were described as not the right fit for our culture, and nobody asked what fit meant or whose culture it was. The meetings where ideas from certain people in the room somehow became other people's ideas by the time the decision was made. The performance reviews where the same behavior got described differently depending on who was being described." He stopped. "Not loud things, not dramatic things, quiet things, built into how we operate at a level nobody had to think about consciously because it had been there long enough to feel like normal. Diane said nothing. I am also responsible for that, Roland said. By saying nothing. For 7 years, I am part of it. The room was quiet for a moment. He spent 9 months on our technology, Roland said. 9 months. He commissioned independent reviews. He had 4 technical teams examine our core architecture. He believed in what those engineers built. He flew across the country because he believed in it. A pause. And he believed, I think, that the person running the company might be someone worth believing in, too. That was the second thing he was here to evaluate. Diane closed her eyes. He got his answer, she said. Yes. Roland stood up. He did. He walked to the door. Then he stopped. He turned around, one hand on the door frame. There's something else you should know, he said. When I was going through the archive files this afternoon, looking for the contact history with his team, he stopped. Elijah Okafor applied for a junior analyst position here in 2009, before the fund, before everything. Another pause. The rejection letter is in the file. The reason listed is culture fit. Diane stared at him. I don't know if you signed off on that decision or if it was below your level at the time, Roland said, but I thought you should know it's there. He left. Diane sat in the silence of the office for a very long time. She thought about 9 months of work. She thought about 4 independent technical reviews. She thought about a man who had been told in 2009 that he wasn't the right fit for a company she was running, who had then gone and built something worth $2.3 billion, who had come back a decade and a half later still willing to believe in what those engineers had built, still willing to walk into a room and extend his hand, and she had pointed at him like he was a problem to be removed. She thought about the rejection letter, culture fit. She thought about Roland saying, I told myself it was above my station. I told myself someone else would address it. She thought about how many times she had said those same things to herself, about things she had seen and not looked at directly. The brief was still on her desk. She had read the whole thing now, every page. She picked up her phone and looked at the airline confirmation. First flight out. 5:45 in the morning, Chicago. She was not going to sleep tonight. She could already feel that. The night was going to be long and quiet, and she was going to spend it the way you spend certain nights in a life, sitting with something true about yourself that you can no longer not see. She had a statement to write. Not for Denise Park, not yet. Not for the board. Not for Arthur Neville, for herself first. She opened a blank document on her laptop. She stared at the cursor blinking on the empty white page. Then she started typing. 5:45 in the morning. The airport was quiet in the particular way airports are quiet before the day's first rush. Tired light. Cleaning crews. A coffee cart with a man behind it who looked like he had been there all night. Diane was at the gate 20 minutes early. She had not slept. She was wearing the clothes she had put on at 4 in the morning when she finally stopped trying to sleep and accepted that the night was over whether or not the morning had arrived. Dark jeans. A blazer she had grabbed without thinking. No jewelry, no makeup. She hadn't noticed until she was in the elevator going down and saw herself in the mirrored doors. She looked like a person instead of a performance. She wasn't sure which of those she'd been trying to be. There were no business class seats available on the first flight out. She had taken economy without thinking about it. The seat was a middle seat between a college student with headphones and an older man reading a physical newspaper. She sat between them and folded her hands in her lap and stared at the back of the seat in front of her. When the flight reached cruising altitude, she opened her bag and took out the brief. The brief she had not read yesterday morning. She had read it twice last night. But she read it again now, slowly this time, without urgency, without looking for the thing that was going to tell her what she could do to fix this. Just reading it the way you are supposed to read something when you actually want to understand it. Elijah Okafor grew up in Chicago, South Side. The neighborhood's name meant nothing to her when she read it the first time. She had looked it up at 2 in the morning on her laptop. She understood it better now. His mother had worked at a hospital during the day and cleaned offices at night. She had attended every parent-teacher conference at her children's school, even when she worked a double shift the day before. She had told Elijah, according to one profile, that the only thing she could give him that nobody could take away was what he knew. So he had better know as much as possible. He had taken that seriously. There was a section in the brief about his investment philosophy that Roland had highlighted before giving it to Diane. She had seen the highlight. She had not stopped to read the highlighted section. She read it now. "The question I am always trying to answer," it read, "is whether the person across the table sees the people around them or only the transaction those people represent. I have found that the answer to that question tells me almost everything I need to know about whether an investment will succeed or fail. Companies are built by people. Leadership either unlocks what people can do, or it decides in advance that certain people are not worth unlocking. Those are very different companies." She put the brief in her lap. The man beside her had fallen asleep. The college student was watching something on a small screen with the volume down low. She looked out the small oval window at the flat, pale sky above the clouds. She thought about Roland's voice saying, "Culture fit." She thought about what kind of company she had been building. She thought about the engineers who had actually built the technology Elijah believed in. Who they were. Where they had come from. Who had been allowed into those rooms and who hadn't. She thought about the 3,200 people who worked for her and had no idea how close everything had gotten to the edge. The seat was uncomfortable. The coffee from the cart had gone cold. She did not care about any of that. She was going to Chicago. She did not know what she was going to say when she got there. She knew only that she had to go, and that whatever happened next had to be more real than anything she had let herself be in a very long time. The building was on a tree-lined street in the West Loop. Not the kind of address that announced itself. No gleaming tower, no name carved in stone. Just a mid-rise with clean lines and a glass facade that caught the morning light without demanding attention. Diane stood on the sidewalk outside and looked at it. She had been in buildings like this before. She had been in every kind of building there was, in every kind of city, on every kind of errand. This was not the kind of building she normally noticed. It was the kind she walked past on her way to somewhere more impressive. That thought arrived, and she recognized it for exactly what it was. She went in. The lobby was different from anything she had expected. Not marble, not gold, not the particular language of money that said, "Look at what we have and what you don't." It was warm, lighter, wood in natural tones, plants in real soil in large containers along the walls, photographs on the walls, not achievements, not headlines, not the curated evidence of importance. The photographs were of people, communities, streets, projects. A school in a neighborhood that looked like the one she had looked up on her laptop at 2 in the morning. The ceiling was high, but not cold. Light came in from a wall of windows on the east side and lay in long rectangles on the floor. People moved through the space with a particular energy she could not immediately name. It took her a moment to find the word. Purpose. Not performance, purpose. She walked to the reception desk. The young woman behind it was perhaps 25. She had the calm of someone who spent her days managing important traffic without being impressed by it. She looked up at Diane with an open, neutral face. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to see Elijah Okafor," Diane said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She paused. "But it's urgent. I flew in from the East Coast. I only need a few minutes." The young woman's expression did not change. Not friendly, not unfriendly. Simply professional in the way of someone who had handled many versions of this conversation before. "Your name?" she asked. "Diane Harwell." Something happened behind the young woman's eyes. Not quite recognition. Something more like the face of a person who has just placed a piece of information into a context that gives it a particular weight. She picked up the phone on her desk. She dialed a short number. She turned slightly away and spoke quietly. Then she hung up. "Mr. Okafor is in meetings all day," she said. Her voice was exactly as warm and exactly as neutral as before. "I'm not able to interrupt his schedule." "I understand," Diane said. "I'll wait." Another small pause. The young woman looked at her. Steady, professional, completely unimpressed by the name that had opened most doors Diane had walked toward. "You're welcome to have a seat," the young woman said. Diane turned around and looked at the lobby. There was a seating area to the left, low chairs in a warm fabric, a small table with a water pitcher and glasses, a stack of current business publications in a neat pile. She sat down, and then she noticed something she had not noticed coming in: the photographs again. She had a clearer view of them from this angle. One in particular caught her attention, taken on a street she recognized now from her late-night research. South Side. A woman at a kitchen table, hands folded, looking not at the camera but out a window at something the camera couldn't see. There was a quality to her face that Diane had seen in exactly one other place, in the Forbes profile, in a photograph of Elijah Okafor at a podium, the same particular set of the jaw, the same quality of calm that was not absence but presence. The kind of face that knows exactly where it comes from and has decided that where it comes from is something to carry with dignity rather than hide. His mother. The photograph of his mother was hanging in the lobby of the company he had built. Diane looked at it for a long time. She thought about the woman who had worked 3 jobs and attended every parent-teacher conference on double-shift days, who had told her son the only thing nobody could take away was what he knew, and then watched him go out and know everything he could possibly know about everything that mattered to him. She thought about where she had grown up, the house with the name, the father who had told her the world divided into people who mattered and people who served. The certainty that she had inherited so completely she had never once thought to examine it. She had arrived at middle age having never spent a single serious moment questioning whether the certainty was true or just convenient for the kind of person she had been born as. She looked at the water pitcher on the small table. She poured herself a glass. She waited. The morning wore on. Employees came and went. Some of them recognized her. She could see it in the moment of pause before they looked away. The slight adjustment of trajectory so they didn't have to walk past her. The thing that happens when a person is placed in a context that makes them a different kind of fact from the kind they usually represent. She had always been a fact that people adjusted toward. This was the first time she could remember being a fact that people adjusted away from. She watched a man cross the lobby carrying a stack of files, stop to hold the elevator for a colleague, smile at something the colleague said. Small thing, nothing. But she watched it. The way he held the door, like it was simply what you did. A woman came out of a glass-walled conference room and walked straight to the young woman at reception, pulled up a chair and sat beside her rather than in front of the desk, and they talked about something with their heads slightly together, like people who trusted each other. And then the woman laughed at something and patted the younger woman's shoulder and went back toward the conference room. That was not nothing either. These were small things, ordinary things. Things that happened in offices all over the world, all the time. But Diane watched them with the particular attention of someone who is starting to understand that what looks ordinary from the inside of a certain frame looks very different from the outside. At 11:15, Amara Cole came through the lobby. Diane recognized her from photographs. Elijah's chief advisor. The woman who had been with him since the beginning. She was brisk and focused, and carrying a laptop under one arm. She was going somewhere with intention. She stopped when she saw Diane. The stop was not theatrical. It was simply the honest stop of a person who did not expect to see a particular face in a particular place. They looked at each other. Amara Cole's face did not offer anything that hadn't been earned. Not hostility, not welcome. Just a clear, direct look that said, "I see you, and I know exactly who you are. And I'm making no assumptions about why you're here." Then she continued across the lobby. Diane watched her go. She thought about the call Amara had made the day before, the one on the sidewalk outside the Grand Meridian. Amara had been on the other end when Elijah said, "Cancel the rest of my day and book me home." She had heard the whole exchange. She had watched 9 months of work come to an end in a 3-minute phone call. Noon came. The woman at reception brought Diane a cup of coffee without being asked. Set it on the table beside her, said nothing, didn't smile, just put the coffee down and went back to the desk. The unrequested courtesy of it hit Diane somewhere she was not expecting. She held the cup in both hands. She thought about Jerome again, the way he had apologized at the glass doors of the Grand Meridian, the way Elijah had said, "It's not you." The exchange between two people in a bad situation together, one of whom was being wronged and one of whom was carrying out someone else's wrong. And somehow there had been enough grace between them in that moment for acknowledgement to pass both directions. She had not thought about Jerome's side of it until last night. What it cost someone to spend 22 years doing what Jerome did, walking people out, following instructions, having no choice, carrying in his body the specific weight of that kind of work. She had never thought about that before, never had a reason to. 1 o'clock. A group of analysts came through the lobby in an animated cluster, young, diverse, loud with energy. One of them was in the middle of explaining something technical with his hands, and the others were listening with the focused interest of people who genuinely cared about what he was saying. They filed into a room, and the door closed, and the lobby was quiet again. Diane thought about the engineers who had built the technology at her company, who they were, who had been allowed in those rooms over the years, who had not been allowed in, whose ideas had made it through and whose had been described as not quite right, without anyone being able to say exactly why. The math began to accumulate in her. She had used 3 minutes to decide he didn't deserve to stand in her lobby, Roland had said, or something like that. She was replaying it now, not precisely, but in the shape of it. She has now spent more than 3 hours in his. She had needed 3 minutes. She had been here for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The distance between those two numbers was the whole of what she had never understood about the world. At 1:15, the young woman came to her again. She crossed the lobby with her hands folded, professional and unhurried. "Mr. Okafor will give you 15 minutes, she said. "There's a conference room on the 4th floor. I'll take you up." Diane put down the empty coffee cup. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the flight and from 3 hours in a low chair. She was tired in a way that went past sleep. She was hungry. She had not eaten since the airport. None of that mattered. "Thank you," she said. The young woman nodded once. They went to the elevator. The conference room was simple, a rectangular table, 6 chairs, one wall of glass looking out at the city, a whiteboard on the opposite wall with something in dry erase marker from a meeting that had happened before this one. Elijah was already there. He was wearing a plain button-down and jeans. He was seated at the far end of the table. He did not stand when she entered. He did not offer his hand. He gestured to the chair across the table from him, not warmly, not coldly, with the level attention of a person who has decided to be present without deciding anything else yet. Diane sat. She put her bag on the floor. She had been rehearsing the flight over, the words, the structure of the apology. She was good at words. She had spent 43 years being good at words in rooms. She knew how to frame things, how to present the version of a situation that made it manageable, navigable, something that could be moved through toward a result. She had not been able to write a single sentence she trusted. "Mr. Okafor," she began. He raised one hand, a small gesture. "Before you apologize," he said, "I want to make one thing clear." His voice was the same voice it had been in the lobby, low, even, the same voice that had said, "There's no need for an escort to Jerome." "Because every email you've sent and every message you've left has framed this as a problem of not knowing who I was." Diane's mouth stayed open. Nothing came out of it. "The problem was never that you didn't know my net worth," he said. He folded his hands on the table. His voice did not rise. It stayed exactly where it was. But each word landed harder for the steadiness of it. "The problem is that you looked at a man in a plain shirt and decided before I said a single word that he didn't belong in that room. You refused my hand. You called security. You had me walked out of a building in front of 50 people." A pause. "If I had been a 60-year-old white man in an expensive suit, Would you have done any of that? Would you have looked me up and down and called me a liar? Would you have had me walked to the street? Diane looked at him. She had spent 43 years performing certainty. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she had nothing to perform. No, she said. The word barely crossed the table. No, I wouldn't have. That's the problem, Elijah said. Not a mistaken identity, not a hectic morning. Something in Diane's face changed. Not broke. Something more specific than broke. The particular shift of a face when the last held thing releases. The tears came, and she did not wipe them because wiping them would have been a performance too. And she had none left. You're right, she said, and I'm ashamed. I didn't come here to explain myself because there is no explanation. There's only the fact of what I did. She made herself hold his eyes. I came to ask for something I have no right to ask for. A breath. My company employs 3,200 people who did nothing wrong, who showed up every day and did good work and have no idea how close to the edge everything has gotten. If you say no, I deserve the no, but they don't. Elijah looked at her, a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not into warmth, not into the particular softness of someone who has forgiven, something more careful than that. The face of a person making a decision that has nothing to do with how he feels right now and everything to do with what he has decided to be. You sat in my lobby for over 3 hours, he said. Yes. Yesterday morning, you had me walked out of yours in 3 minutes. He let that sit. She did not fill the silence. It's interesting, he said, how quickly a person's sense of who's worth waiting for changes when they need something. I know, she said. She did not defend it. I'll invest, Elijah said. Diane's breath caught. He lifted his hand again before she could speak. Don't thank me, not until you've heard the conditions. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. She took it. She read it. Her hands began to shake before she reached the third line. The paper was one side of one page, typed in plain font. No letterhead, no legal language, just words on a page written by someone who had decided that plain language was the only kind worth using when something truly important needed to be said. Diane read it slowly. The way you read something when you understand that rushing it would be a betrayal of what it's asking you to be. The first condition was a public acknowledgement, not a statement crafted by a public relations team, not the language of misunderstanding and scheduling errors and deeply regret any offense. The language of exactly what had happened, named plainly with nothing softened and nothing left out. The word racial profiling was on the page. She read it twice. Then she kept reading. The second condition was an independent audit. A full examination of how the company was operated from the top down. Not an internal review with findings that would be seen by 6 people and archived. A real audit by an outside firm with no existing relationship to Harwell Technologies. And the findings, whatever they were, however uncomfortable, would be made public. Not buried, not summarized into something manageable. Published. Third was a restructured board. The current board was 10 people. 9 of them looked nearly identical in the ways that boards were not supposed to be identical in. New faces were required, people who had actually experienced the world from angles the current board had never been made to consider. Fourth was a donation from her personal funds. Not the company's money, hers, to organizations that worked to open doors in the industries that had spent decades deciding certain people didn't belong. The amount on the page made her inhale sharply. She kept reading. Fifth was sustained work with an independent coach. Not a one-day workshop, not a sensitivity training that could be scheduled and completed and filed away as done. Months of real, uncomfortable work, quarterly reporting on what had been covered and what had changed as a result. Sixth was full quarterly reporting on all of the above, to Elijah's team, to the public. No cherry-picking of progress, the full picture, whatever it showed. And seventh, the last condition, her own transition out of the role of chief executive, voluntary. on a timeline to be negotiated but beginning immediately, making room in the company's leadership for someone it should have elevated a long time ago. She looked up from the paper. Elijah was watching her with the same level, careful attention he had brought to the entire meeting. "This is the end," she said, not as a complaint, not as a protest, as a fact she was placing on the table between them so they could both look at it honestly. "Of who I've been for 43 years. The title, the office, the identity I built on believing I belonged at the center of everything." "Yes," he said. She looked at the paper again. She thought about the board session the night before, the one she had not been invited to attend. Arthur Neville's voice saying, "You've been building this for 20 years and what happened in that lobby was 47 seconds. She thought about Roland saying, "I told myself it was above my station." She thought about the rejection letter in the archive files. Culture fit. 2009. A man who had then gone and built $2.3 billion worth of proof that the decision had been wrong. She thought about the engineer team, the ones who had actually built the technology, the ones who had shown up every day for years, believing in something real, believing that the person running the company was going to get it to where it needed to go. She thought about 3,200 people. She put the paper back on the table. "I agree," she said. "Don't thank me," Elijah said again. His voice was steady, not cruel, not warm, honest. "I want you to be very clear about this because it matters. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for 3,200 people who had no say in how you treated a stranger in a lobby." He leaned back. "And I'm doing it for every person who gets looked at and decided about before they say a word. The ones who don't run funds worth billions, who can't fly across the country to demand a meeting, who just absorb it again and again and are expected to keep absorbing it in silence." A pause, the kind of pause that earns its length. Most of them never get an apology. Most of them never get a room like this, or a sheet of paper, or a second chance. You're getting one because 3,200 people are standing behind you, and you happen to be the one holding the door. He met her eyes. "Don't mistake it for grace." Diane stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected. She picked up her bag. She folded the paper and placed it carefully in the front pocket where she could not lose it. At the door she stopped. She had to ask. She turned back. "Why?" she said. Elijah looked at her. "If you believe everything you just said," she said, "and I think you do if you have walked away from investments before because of what you saw in a lobby, why trust me to actually do the work? Why not just let the company fail and walk away like you were already going to?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't trust you," he said. "Not yet. What I said is true. I'm doing this for the people behind you, not for you. But, since you're asking..." He paused. "Sit in someone's lobby for 3 hours. Show up without PR. Show up without armor. Say on the record what you actually did without softening language. And then ask them, not me, whether they see the beginning of something real or just another performance." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm watching," he said. "The way I always watch. The same way I walked into your lobby yesterday in a plain shirt to see what I would find. The test didn't end when I walked out. It didn't end when you flew here. It doesn't end. Ever." A pause. "That's the part people like you always get wrong. You think there's a finish line. There isn't one. There's only what you do next, and next, and next after that." He picked up a pen from the table. Trust isn't handed across a conference table in exchange for a signature. It's built slowly in the only currency I've ever respected. His voice dropped just slightly. "Which isn't words." Diane looked at him. "What is it?" she asked. He looked back. "It's what a person does when they think the test is finally over." She nodded once. She turned and walked out the door. The elevator was waiting. She wrote it down alone. In the lobby, she stopped once and looked at the photograph of the woman at the kitchen table. The hands folded. The eyes looking at something the camera couldn't see. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked out into the Chicago afternoon. She called Arthur Neville in the cab on the way to the airport. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear something in the background, the quiet of a room recently emptied, papers being gathered. "It's done," he said. No preamble. "The board met again this morning. After last night, we needed to convene formally and move properly." A pause. "You're removed as chief executive effective immediately. You'll be offered a non-executive board seat on a 6-month transitional basis while the transition is managed." "I know," Diane said. A pause. "You know?" "There's a condition in the investment agreement," she said. "I've already agreed to it." Silence on the line. "The investment is going through?" Arthur asked. "Yes." The silence had a different quality now, not the winter cold of the call the night before. Something more complicated. The silence of a man recalibrating. "Who takes the company?" Diane asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Dr. Sandra Guillen," Arthur said. The name hit her differently than she expected. Sandra Guillen, COO. 3 years. The quietest, steadiest, most prepared person in every meeting she had ever been in. The person who always arrived having read every document, having considered every angle, having anticipated every question that had not yet been asked. The person Diane had passed over 3 times. The first time she had passed Sandra over, she had described it to Roland as a question of presence. Sandra was brilliant, she had said, truly brilliant. But she didn't command a room. She listened more than she spoke. She wasn't the kind of leader the company needed at this stage. She had believed that when she said it. She heard it differently now. She had been describing a woman who operated with a different kind of strength than the kind she recognized. A woman whose power was in precision and patience, and the deep intelligence of someone who understood that listening was not the absence of power, but often the most disciplined use of it. Diane had looked at that and called it not enough, the way she had looked at a plain gray shirt and called it not enough. The same move, different room, same blind spot. "She'll be good," Diane said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her. Not generous, true. A genuine reckoning with something she had been wrong about for 3 years. "She'll be excellent," Arthur said. Something in his voice had softened infinitesimally. The smallest acknowledgement that she had said the right thing without needing to perform it. "She's already been briefed. She's already read every file." A pause. "She read the Okafor brief the day it arrived. 6 months ago." Diane closed her eyes in the back of the cab. "Of course she did," she said. "I have to ask you something directly," Arthur said. "Go ahead." "The statement, the one in the conditions. Are you prepared to actually say what you did? Not the version your PR team would write. What you actually did." "Yes," she said. On record, in a room with cameras, without the language of misunderstanding. "Yes." "Why?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She looked out the window at the Chicago streets going by. The ordinary texture of a city going about its ordinary day. People at bus stops, a woman with a stroller, a delivery truck double parked with its hazards on. The 1,000 small, ordinary details of a world that did not know or care what had happened in a marble lobby the day before, or in a 4th-floor conference room this morning. "Because he told me trust isn't words," she said. "And he's right. And the public statement is the first place I have to prove he's right." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "The board will want to be consulted on the language," he said. "The language is mine," Diane said. "That's one of the conditions. It has to be." Another pause. "All right," Arthur said. "I'll convene the board for a briefing on the investment terms. You don't need to attend that either." "I know." "Diane." His voice had lost the last of its winter edge. What was left underneath it was something she had not heard from Arthur Neville in a very long time. Maybe ever. A kind of plainness that required no performance from either of them. "For what it's worth that you went. That you sat in his lobby and waited, and then took what was given without negotiating around it. That matters." "Does it?" "To the kind of people who are watching this closely, yes." A pause. It won't undo what happened. Nothing will undo it. But what comes after it is still being written. She said goodbye. She hung up. The cab pulled up to the departures curb. She had a statement to write on the plane home. She wrote it at 4 in the morning. She threw it away and started again at 5 because the first version had the softening language in it. The phrases she had spent 43 years using to make things more manageable, more survivable. The language that let you say what you did without quite saying all of it. She started again with a blank page and a commitment to write one sentence at a time that was completely true. The press conference was in the largest room at Harwell Technologies. No makeup artist had come. She had not called one. No public relations team had seen the statement in advance. Roland had asked to review it, and she had told him she appreciated that, but no. Arthur Neville had asked to have his team look at the language, and she had told him the same thing. She stood at the podium in a dark blazer with a single page in her hand. The room was full. Business press, national press, a camera crew from a network. Denise Park in the third row with a notebook and a recorder watching with the particular attention of a journalist who has been right about something and is now watching it be confirmed. The lights were very bright. Diane looked at the people in the room, and then she looked at the page in her hand, and she started reading. 3 days ago, she said. Her voice shook, and she let it shake. There was nothing to gain from steadiness now. I committed an act of racial profiling. I refused to shake the hand of a man who had traveled across the country to meet with me. I looked at the color of his skin and the price of his clothes, and I decided in under 3 seconds that he did not belong in the room I was standing in. She heard the cameras. She kept reading. I called security on him. I had him walked out of a building in front of 50 people. I then turned back to my other guests and acted as though I had handled a small unpleasantness, and the important business of the day could resume. She stopped, made herself look up, made herself see the faces. There is no excuse for what I did. This was not a stressful morning. This was not a scheduling mistake. This was prejudice mine, and it did real harm to a person who had done nothing but offer me his hand. She read the commitments, the independent audit, the restructured board, the personal donation, the sustained work with a coach, the real kind, the uncomfortable kind, with full quarterly reporting, the transition out of her role as chief executive. And then she looked up from the page and met the eyes of the room, and stayed there. Denise Park raised her hand. Diane nodded at her. Would you have faced any of these consequences? Denise Park asked, if the man in the lobby hadn't happened to be a billionaire? The room went very still. Diane stood in the bright lights with the single page in her hand. She could feel everyone in that room waiting for the answer. Not just waiting, wanting something particular. Wanting the answer that would make the story satisfying. The answer that said, yes, I have changed. Yes, I see it. Yes, everything is going to be different now. She could give them that answer. She was good at giving rooms the answer they wanted. No, she said. The word was very quiet. She made herself say it louder. No. If Elijah Okafor had been an ordinary man in ordinary clothes, no one would have recorded it. No board would have convened. No press conference would have happened. I would have gone back to my office and forgotten his face by lunch, the way I have forgotten 100 faces before his. She stopped. Let that sit. I am facing consequences only because the man I wronged had power. The people I wronged before him. And I am standing here telling you there were people before him because they were simply absorbed it. They went home and were expected to keep absorbing it in silence. She looked at the page one more time. Not to read from it, just to have something to look at that was not the faces of the room while she said the last thing. That's the real problem. It's bigger than what I did in a lobby. It's built into the way rooms like mine have been run for a very long time. And it doesn't get solved by watching one woman be held accountable at a podium. It gets solved slowly by people who decide to do the work even when nobody is recording and the test seems to be over. She looked up. I am starting that work. I am late. That is also true. She folded the paper. She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet in a different way after that. Not the quiet of people who had gotten what they came for. Something more uncomfortable than that. Something that required more from them than watching a consequence land. Something that made the story harder to file away with a headline and a verdict. Denise Park wrote something in her notebook. The cameras kept recording. Diane stepped off the platform and walked to the side of the room where she had left her bag. And she picked it up and she walked toward the door. Roland was there. He was standing just inside the door. He was not holding a folder. He was not holding anything. He just looked at her as she walked toward him, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and are on the other side of it, and do not yet know exactly what the other side looks like. Then she walked out the door. The consequences did not stop. This was the thing about consequences, the real ones. They did not arrive in a single dramatic moment and then resolve themselves. They moved like weather. They kept coming in different forms for longer than felt entirely fair, and also for exactly as long as made sense. The other boards she sat on asked her to step down. They were polite about it. No public statements. The kind of careful courtesy that says, we are not making this dramatic, which is itself a kind of judgment. She resigned from each of them, one by one, 6 in total. Each resignation a small, separate thing that was also part of the same large thing. The speaking invitations dried up. Conferences that had booked her months in advance quietly sent emails asking if she would prefer to defer to next year. She declined to defer. She withdrew. The calendar that had been full for 18 months opened up white and empty. 2 organizations she applied to join after the press conference replied with polite declines. No explanation offered. None needed. At a fundraiser she had attended for 9 years, she arrived and the room changed. In that particular way, a room changes when someone walks into it who has become a different kind of fact than they used to be. Conversations quieted. Not all of them, not dramatically, just enough. Just that small rearrangement of attention that signals someone's presence has become complicated. 3 people she had known for years found reasons to be somewhere else in the room. She left early. She drove home through streets she had driven 1,000 times. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. But here was the thing she had not expected. She was not destroyed. She had expected destruction. She had built her whole life on the certainty that to lose what she was losing would be destruction. The title, the invitations, the rooms, the particular social geography of a world that had always placed her at its center. She was not at the center anymore. And she was not destroyed. She was something more interesting and more difficult than destroyed. She was seen. For the first time in as long as she could examine, she was being seen by the world at exactly the angle the world had always had of her, without her ever having been made to turn and face it. She had spent her whole life making a particular kind of exile for people who did not fit the rooms she decided about. She was now inside that experience. Not the full version. She would never be inside the full version. Her exile had an address and a bank account and a phone that still rang with offers, smaller ones, different ones. Her exile was livable, which was its own kind of education about what she had been making for other people all along. She went to her first session with the coach on a Tuesday morning in October. She sat across from a woman in a plain office with a plant on the windowsill and a clock she could see from where she sat, and she told the truth for 50 minutes in a way that was more complete than the press conference, because there was no audience and no statement and nothing to perform for. It was the hardest 50 minutes she could remember. She signed up for the next session before she left. She thought about walking away from it every week for the first month. Every week she went back anyway. Not because it was getting easier, because Elijah had said, the test doesn't end. And because she had agreed to quarterly reporting, and she meant to honor it. She made the personal donation. She transferred the funds herself, so it was not an action her team could take on her behalf. She made it in her own name. Then she went and met with the organizations receiving it. Not to be thanked, just to be present. Just to sit in a room and hear what the work actually looked like up close, without the filter of her assumptions. One afternoon in November, she ran into Jerome. She was coming out of a coffee shop near the hotel district. He was on his way in. He recognized her immediately. She saw the recognition in his face, and she saw him make a quiet decision about what to do with it. "Ms. Harwell," he said, "just that. Nothing waited, nothing offered or withheld." "Jerome," she said. A pause. "I've been thinking about that morning," she said. "What it was like for you." He looked at her steadily. 22 years of doing a job that required him to absorb other people's decisions. A face that had learned to hold things carefully. 22 years, he said. That morning was the worst morning of those 22 years. She did not say she was sorry again. She had said she was sorry before cameras and reporters, and that was done. This was different. This just needed to be heard and held. "I know," she said. He nodded once. He went in for his coffee. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she walked to her car. The deal closed on a Thursday morning in late October, $500 million. Okafor Capital's full proposed investment unchanged from what had been on the table before the lobby. Elijah had not reduced the amount. He had not added punitive terms beyond the conditions already agreed to. He had simply done what he had said he would do in the way he had said he would do it, because that was how he operated, and had always operated. The number that had made Diane's hands go cold when she looked at it the 11 weeks, the 9.4 million burning every month. The countdown that had no good ending stopped being a countdown. The 3,200 people kept their jobs. Most of them would never know how close it had gotten. Most of them came in on the Friday after the deal closed and made coffee and sat at their desks and attended their meetings and had no idea that the specific texture of their ordinary day had required an extraordinary sequence of events to remain possible. They would never know about the lobby of the Grand Meridian, or the fourth-floor conference room in Chicago, or the 3 hours in a waiting chair, or the single sheet of paper. They just came to work, and the work was still there. Elijah released a statement through his office when the deal closed. He had written it himself. It was 4 sentences. "Real change requires more than words. We will be watching closely to see whether the commitments made are honored, not as a formality, but as a genuine measure of whether something true is being attempted. This investment was never about one incident. It is about the 1,000 quiet ones that never make the news, and about building something here that takes them seriously." That statement was shared more than the video from the lobby, more than the press conference clip, more than the coverage, more than the op-ed Denise Park published 2 days after the press conference that had been read by 4 million people. Just 4 sentences, plain language, the kind that landed because it had been written by someone who had no interest in being impressive and every interest in being clear. Sandra Guillen read the statement at her desk on her first morning as chief executive. She read it twice. Then she printed it out and put it on the wall directly across from where she sat, so she could see it from her chair. Then she started her first day. Sandra Guillen had been with Harwell Technologies for 6 years. She had arrived as VP of Engineering Operations, been promoted to COO after 18 months, and had spent the 3 years since then being the most prepared person in every meeting she attended. She arrived early. She read everything. She returned calls same day. She knew the names of people 3 levels below her in the organization because she had made a point of learning them. She kept a notebook in every meeting and wrote down what was said not as a performance of diligence, but because she genuinely believed that what people said when they thought they were being heard was more informative than what they said in formal presentations. She had been passed over 3 times. She had not made a scene about it. She had not circulated her resume. She had not gone to Roland or Arthur Neville and made her case in the language of advocacy. She had kept showing up, doing the work, filing away what she observed about why decisions were made the way they were made, and waiting. When the board called her, she was ready. Not because she had been expecting it. She had genuinely not known it was coming. She was ready because she was always ready. Because that was who she was, and had always been. Her first meeting as chief executive was at 9 in the morning the day after her appointment was confirmed. She called 12 people into the conference room, not her direct reports. The 12 people who had been at the company the longest and who were not in executive roles. Engineers, project managers, one woman from the facilities team who had been there since the beginning and knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking, because she had been present for everything. Sandra sat at the table with them and she said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm going to listen without interrupting, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what I got wrong and what I heard." She listened for 40 minutes. She took notes the way she always took notes, not shorthand, complete sentences. Because complete sentences required you to actually understand what you were recording. Then she asked them what she had gotten wrong. They told her. She wrote down what they said. She left the meeting with 3 pages of notes and a specific, concrete understanding of 5 things that were broken in the company that no one above her level had ever acknowledged or addressed. She called her second meeting of the day. She reversed a hiring policy that had been in place for 4 years. The policy had been framed as a question of cultural alignment. She had been watching it for 2 years and knew what it actually filtered for. She replaced it with a revised process that had different criteria and required a panel review instead of a single decision maker. She ordered a stop on 2 projects that had been running for 8 months and producing nothing useful. Resources were redistributed to 2 other projects that had been understaffed because the people running them had not had the relationships to advocate effectively for their needs. On her 3rd day, she requested a meeting with Amara Cole, Elijah's chief advisor. The Okafor brief, the brief that had sat unread on Diane's desk, was the first document Sandra had pulled when she was given system access. She had read it the same afternoon. She had then found in the archive files that Elijah Okafor had applied for a position at the company in 2009. She had read the rejection letter. She had sat with that for a while. Then she had called Amara Cole and said she wanted to understand directly what Okafor Capital's priorities were in the relationship going forward, what accountability looked like from their perspective, what success would actually mean. Amara had agreed to the meeting immediately. They met for 2 hours. At the end of it, Amara said, "You're the first person from your company in 6 years of relationship who has asked me that question." Sandra wrote that down too. The independent audit firm arrived in November. 7 people, a 3-month engagement, full access to hiring records, promotion records, performance evaluations, compensation data, exit interview records, and internal communications from the past 8 years. This had been agreed to as a condition of the investment, which meant it was not optional, and it was not something the company could shape or influence once it had begun. The audit team was professional, methodical. They asked for things and received them. They interviewed employees across all levels without management present. They sent no preliminary findings. They communicated nothing about what they were finding until they delivered the final report. The final report was 112 pages. Roland Vance read it in his office with the door closed on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He read it straight through. It took him 4 hours. He did not stop to answer messages. He did not take calls. The findings were not comfortable. There were patterns in the hiring data going back 6 years. When identical qualifications were submitted under names the system had learned to associate with certain demographics, callback rates differed. The gap was not enormous. It did not need to be enormous to compound over time into an organization that looked the way the organization looked. There were patterns in the promotion data. People who performed at the same level, measured by the same metrics, progressed at different rates depending on factors that should not have mattered, and did. There were patterns in compensation. Small gaps, not dramatic. The kind that would look like noise in any individual case, and like a clear signal across 380 cases examined together. There were findings about whose ideas were attributed to whom in meeting records. The audit team had cross-referenced documented contributions in meeting notes against what appeared in subsequent decision memos. The gaps were significant. And there were exit interview records, 7 years of them. People who had left the company explaining in their own words why they had left. The language in those records was careful the way language from people who have learned to be careful is always careful. But the audit team had been trained to read careful language. The themes were consistent. Roland read the report. He sat with it. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the things he had noticed and said nothing about because he had told himself they were above his station, or below the threshold that required action, or someone else's problem to address. He thought about a man who had flown across the country in a plain shirt believing in what the engineers had built, and the 3 minutes it had taken to decide he didn't belong, and the 9 months of careful work that had preceded those 3 minutes, and the weight Elijah Okafor had described carrying in rooms his entire life. The audit found nothing Roland had not already known was there. That was the worst part. Not that the findings were surprising, that they were not. That he had known, in the way that people who pay attention always know, and had made his peace with not naming what he knew, because naming it would have required a kind of courage he had not felt equipped for. Sandra received the report the same day. She had not waited to see Roland's response, or Arthur Neville's response, or anyone else's response. She read it herself, made her own notes, and called a company-wide meeting for the following week. Not a select group, not leadership, everyone. The meeting ran for 3 hours. She presented the findings without softening them. She answered questions directly. When people expressed discomfort, she acknowledged the discomfort and explained why publishing the findings had been a condition she supported and why she supported it. At the end of the meeting, someone asked, "Is this going to lead to anything real, or is this another thing that gets announced and then nothing changes?" Sandra looked at the person who had asked it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I will be reporting on it every quarter, and you will be the first to know if the reporting stops reflecting reality." The room was quiet. Then somebody nodded. Then more people nodded. It was not a triumph. It was a beginning, which is a smaller and more honest thing than a triumph and considerably more useful. 6 months after leaving the role of chief executive, Diane got up at 6:30, made coffee, sat at a table in an apartment that was smaller than her office at Harwell Technologies had been, read the news, read through the quarterly report that Sandra's team had published the week before, read it carefully, not looking for reasons to be reassured, but looking at what it actually said. This was the new rhythm. It did not feel like enough. Most days it did not feel like enough. She was aware of that. She carried it. But she kept going because stopping would not make it feel like more. The coaching sessions were still on Tuesdays. She still wanted to quit them approximately every other week. Not because they were useless, because they were not useless. Because every useful session required her to look at something she had spent 43 years not looking at, and the looking was not becoming easier with practice so much as it was becoming more familiar. She had stopped expecting it to get easy. That was something. The donation had gone to 4 organizations. She had met with each of them personally, not with an assistant, not with a publicist. She had gone and sat in rooms she had never been in and listened to people describe work she had never thought seriously about because it had not been close enough to her world to require her attention. After the first meeting, she had gone home and sat in her apartment for a long time. After the second, she had brought a notebook. After the third, she had asked if she could come back. She went back. She was not their partner yet. She was not their ally yet in any way that meant something beyond good intentions. She knew that. Good intentions were the beginning. They were not the substance. She was working on the substance, slowly, the way Elijah had said trust was built, in the only currency he respected, which wasn't words. She thought about Jerome. She had thought about Jerome almost every day since that afternoon on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. 22 years of doing what he was told and holding the cost of it in his body, without anyone in a position like hers ever thinking to ask what that cost was. She could not undo what Jerome had been asked to carry. She could not undo what Elijah had been made to absorb. She could not undo the 7 years of patterns Roland had laid out in the report he had read in his office with the door closed. She could not undo any of it. That was the truth she had had to sit with longest. The desire to undo it was natural and human, and also completely beside the point. The point was not undoing. The point was what came next. She had found in the months since the press conference that the statement she had made was the only real thing she had done so far. not because it was enough, but because it had been true without performance. And true without performance was harder than it sounded for a person who had spent 4 decades becoming excellent at performance. Everything else was practice. She thought about Elijah's question in the 4th floor conference room. Why trust you to actually do the work instead of performing it? She thought about it most mornings, not as a threat, as a useful thing to carry, a question that kept the practice honest. One afternoon in January, she went back to her office at Harwell Technologies to collect the last of her personal items. Sandra had kept everything organized. The office was being repurposed. The name on the door was already changed. She collected what she had come for. She was almost out the door when she noticed the desk. Her desk. The nameplate was gone. The surface was clear except for a stack of documents, and in the corner, a copy of the Okafor brief. Sandra's copy, open to the investment philosophy section, with handwriting in the margins. Small, careful, precise handwriting. Notes in the margins of the document that Diane had never read on the morning it mattered. Diane looked at the handwriting for a moment. She didn't read what it said. That wasn't hers to read. She put her bag on her shoulder and walked out. October, 1 year after the lobby of the Grand Meridian. The conference was called Leading with Accountability. It ran annually. This was its 5th year. It had grown from a small gathering of about 200 people into something larger and more complicated, the way things that touch something real tend to grow. The moderator was a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei. She had the quality of someone who was not impressed by anything, and therefore did not need to perform being unimpressed. She asked questions the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, without unnecessary motion. Elijah Okafor was on the stage. Diane Harwell was on the stage. They had not seen each other since the 4th floor conference room. There had been communication through Teams. Reports had been submitted and reviewed. The quarterly accountability structure was functioning. There had been no personal contact. They had agreed to the panel independently. Neither of them had known the other was on it until the moderator sent the speaker list 3 weeks before the event. Neither of them had withdrawn. They sat in 2 chairs angled slightly toward each other and toward the audience. Between them was the moderator's chair. Dr. Osei did not begin with pleasantries. "Mr. Okafor," she said, "1 year ago you flew to a city to meet with someone who had requested your investment. You were removed from the lobby before the meeting occurred. You went home. You then invested anyway. I want to ask you directly why." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I've answered a version of that question many times this year," he said. "I want to be precise about it. I invested for 3,200 people. I invested for the engineers who built something real and deserved to see it reach the market. I invested because the commitments attached to the deal represented the beginning of something that might matter if they're honored. I did not invest for Ms. Harwell. The distinction matters, and I want it on record." "It's on record," Dr. Osei said. She turned to Diane. "Ms. Harwell, you made a public statement that was notable for not using the language most public statements use. You said the word prejudice. You said it was yours. You said there were people before Mr. Okafor who absorbed what happened to him without consequence. Why did you say that? You didn't have to." Diane thought about the question. "Because it was true," she said, "and because he told me trust wasn't words, and the statement was the first place I had to prove that." She paused. "The statement was also not enough. I want to say that clearly. It was true, and it was not enough. Those 2 things are both true." Dr. Osei nodded. "What would you tell the woman you were 1 year ago?" she asked. "Walking into that lobby." Diane was quiet for a moment. She looked at the audience. Hundreds of people, different faces, different histories, different experiences of rooms and lobbies, and the particular social geography of who belongs where. "I would tell her that her certainty was blinding her," she said. "That she was about to harm someone because she couldn't see past what she had absorbed without ever examining it. That she had built a career on reading rooms and had never once read herself." She stopped. "And I would tell her that no one should have to be a billionaire to be treated like a human being. That was never the lesson. It was just the only reason the world finally made me learn it. The room was quiet. Dr. Osei turned to Elijah. Is there anything you want to say to this room that you haven't been able to say elsewhere? He looked at the audience. The conversation about what happened in that lobby has been useful, he said. I think the more important conversation is about the 1,000 times it happened to people who don't have a fund worth $2 billion. The people who absorbed it and went home and had no next chapter that the world paid attention to. They are the reason any of this should matter. Not the story that went viral, the stories that didn't. He paused. Those people are in this room, he said. Some of them are on stage. Dr. Osei let the silence sit. Then she said, Thank you both. The room came back to itself slowly, the way rooms do after something real has been said in them. There is a part of this story that never made the news, the part that lives underneath the viral video and the press conference and the investment deal and the conference panel. The part that belongs to a man who never described himself as a symbol and never wanted to be one. Elijah Okafor was 37 years old when he walked into the Grand Meridian. He had been 37 years old for exactly 11 days. He had spent those 11 days the way he spent most of his time when he was not in a meeting or reviewing a proposal or talking to his team. Reading. Thinking. Going for long walks in Chicago in the early morning before the city filled up with its daily noise. He had always needed those walks. His mother had told him once that he had been born with too much to say and not enough patience to say it, and that walking was the only thing that sorted him out. She had been right the way she was right about most things. He had been to a lot of lobbies. This is the part the conference panels and the profiles and the coverage never fully captured. Not because the people doing the coverage were careless, but because he had never tried particularly hard to make this part clear, and it is a difficult thing to communicate to someone who has not experienced it. It was not just the Grand Meridian. It was 14 years of lobbies. The first time he had been mistaken for the help was at a conference in San Francisco in 2011. He had been 31. He had just closed his first significant deal, and he was at the conference because the company he had invested in was presenting. He was standing near the coffee table reading the program when a man in an expensive suit walked up and asked him to refill the coffee. Elijah had looked at the man. He had poured the coffee, not because he was afraid, not because he was defeated, because he was in a room full of people he needed to be able to talk to later, and he had made a precise calculation about what the next 30 seconds were going to cost him if he made them about what they actually were. That calculation, that specific internal arithmetic, he had run it more times than he could count. The calculation was the part nobody saw and nobody asked about, and nobody wrote conference panel questions about. Because the calculation happened in private, in the body, in the moment before anyone else in the room had any idea anything was happening. The broom story was real too. The one he had referenced in the interview Diane had read at 2 in the morning. He had been handed a broom at a tech summit in Boston in 2015. A caterer's broom. A woman in a catering uniform had handed it to him with a nod toward a spill near the door and said something about the setup crew being short-staffed. He had been wearing his standard plain shirt and dark trousers. He had taken the broom and leaned it against the wall and gone back to his drink. Amara had seen it happen. She had crossed the room to him immediately. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked. She was furious in the quiet way she was furious, which was the most effective kind. "Because she's working a catering shift," Elijah had said. "And she made a reasonable assumption based on available information. She's not the problem." "What is the problem?" "The room," he had said. "The fact that this is still the room." He had not been angry that day. He had been tired in a way that went past sleep. The particular tiredness of a person who has been doing something for a long time that takes more than effort. That takes something quieter and more private that doesn't have a clean name. On the sidewalk outside the Grand Meridian, after Jerome had held the door and apologized and Elijah had told him it wasn't him, the tiredness had come back. He had stood on that sidewalk and breathed. He had felt the weight of it returning, the way you feel the weight of something familiar. Not unexpected, just there again. The weight of being decided about before you have said a single word based on something the room had decided it knew about you before you arrived. He had felt it. And then he had answered Amara's call. And then he had gone home. What he had not told anyone, not Amara, not in any interview, not on any panel, was what had happened that evening back in Chicago. He had gone to his apartment. He had made dinner. He had sat at his kitchen table the way he had sat at kitchen tables his whole life, under a light that was adequate, with his thoughts organized in front of him. And he had thought about pulling the Harwell file, not the investment. He had already closed that door in his mind. He had meant what he said to Amara on the sidewalk. The answer he had come for he had received. The 3 minutes had told him what 9 months of financial analysis could not. But the file, the technology. He had opened his laptop and he had read the technical summary again. Not the company profile, just the engineering section. What the 3 engineers had actually built. The specifics of the architecture. What it could do that nothing else in the market could currently do. It was still real. It had not become less real because of what had happened in a lobby. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about the engineers, who they were, what they had made. The fact that what they had made was genuinely valuable and would not survive if the company ran out of money in 11 weeks. He thought about the 3,200 people. He opened a new document. He started writing conditions, not as an act of forgiveness. He was not ready for that, and was not certain he would ever use that word for what had happened, but as an act of precision about what it would take to turn a terrible thing into something that might very slowly, under the right conditions, contribute to something better than it had been. He wrote the conditions the way he wrote everything that mattered. Plain language, complete sentences, nothing softened and nothing left out. He was still at his kitchen table at midnight. His mother would have told him to go to bed. He finished the document. He sent it to Amara. He went to bed. This story went viral because of who Elijah Okafor is. Because the man Diane Harwell pointed at like litter in a hotel lobby happened to run a fund worth $2.3 billion. Because there happened to be a phone recording. Because the recording happened to be seen by 2 million people before noon the following day. The story traveled because of those things. But those things are not the story. The story is the 1,000 versions of that lobby that happen every day to people who don't run funds worth billions. To people who don't get recordings or press conferences or second chance meetings. To people who simply absorb what happens and go home and are expected quietly and without complaint to keep absorbing it. This is who those people are. A man named Darius applied for a senior engineering role at Harwell Technologies in the spring, 3 years before the Grand Meridian morning. He had 7 years of experience. He had a portfolio of work that the audit would later identify as significantly more substantial than several people who had been hired at comparable levels in the same period. The rejection came in 48 hours. The reason listed was cultural alignment. He never heard anything else. He did not know that the person who made the initial screening decision had never met him. He did not know that cultural alignment meant what it meant. He went home and applied for other positions, and eventually took a role at a different company and built a strong career there, quietly, without the kind of platform or resources that would have allowed him to do what Elijah did. He absorbed it. He went home. There is a woman who worked inside Harwell Technologies for 6 years. Her name is in the audit report anonymized. She is referred to as Employee F. She joined the company with a master's degree in applied mathematics and spent 6 years being the person who found the errors in everyone else's analysis. Not loudly. She was not loud. She found them in her work, which she submitted, and other people in the room were credited with the corrections in the decision memos. She raised this twice. Both times she was told she was being too sensitive. Both times the conversation ended in a way that made it clear that raising the issue a third time would cost her something she could not afford to lose. She absorbed it. She went home every evening and came back every morning because the job paid well, and she had student loans, and the alternative was starting over somewhere new, with no guarantee that somewhere new would be different. She stayed, and she absorbed what staying cost. And then there was Jerome. Jerome is not in the audit report. Jerome does not work for Harwell Technologies. Jerome is a hotel security worker with 22 years in a job that requires him to follow instructions from people who have the money to stay in the hotel he protects, regardless of what those instructions are, because the alternative is losing a job that his family depends on. On the morning of the Grand Meridian, Jerome was asked to escort a man out of a lobby for no reason that made any sense to him. He could see that. He was not an unintelligent person. He was a person in a particular situation where intelligence had no bearing on what was required of him. He did it. He apologized as much as the situation allowed him to apologize. He went back to his desk. He thought about it all day. He thought about it for weeks after. When he saw the video, he had a complicated feeling that was not quite any of the simple feelings the coverage wanted to assign to people. Not satisfaction that consequences had come, not anger at having been made to do what he had been made to do. Something quieter and harder to name. Something like the feeling of a person who has been carrying a weight in silence for a long time, and then sees the weight named publicly, and is relieved that it exists outside themselves now, and at the same time aware that the naming changes nothing about the weight. He still carries it. He still works the same job. He absorbs what the job requires him to absorb. And here's the thing about Darius and Employee F and Jerome and the 100 others like them who populate the real version of this story that the viral video does not contain. They are not bit players in Elijah Okafor's story. They are the actual story. Elijah's story ended with an investment deal and a press conference and a conference panel and a path through the lobby that eventually, through a series of extraordinary circumstances, reached something resembling acknowledgement. Their stories did not end that way. Their stories ended the way most stories about this kind of thing end. Not with resolution. Not with consequence for the person who made the wrong decision. Not with a sheet of paper with conditions on it and a 4-sentence public statement and an independent audit. Just with the ordinary ongoing work of moving through a world that decided certain things about them before they opened their mouths, and finding ways to keep going anyway. Elijah knew this. He had said it at the conference. The people who should be at the center of this conversation are the ones who weren't in that lobby. The ones for whom there was no recording, no viral moment, no second chapter that the world paid attention to. They are the reason any of this should matter. Not the story that went viral, the stories that didn't. 1 year after the deal closed, 18 months after the Grand Meridian, Harwell Technologies was not the same company. This is the complicated truth about what changed and what didn't. It requires precision. It resists the simple version that says everything got better, and also resists the cynical version that says nothing ever really changes. Under Sandra Guillen, the revenue picture improved. The core technology had reached a stage of market readiness. 2 products had launched. Early results were strong. The burn rate had been reduced by 31%. The company was not yet profitable, but the runway had extended considerably, and the trajectory looked sustainable. That mattered. It was real. It was the result of the engineers' work, which had been real all along, and the leadership that finally created conditions for the work to reach where it needed to go. The board had been restructured. 6 of the original 10 members had cycled out, some by term completion, some by resignation. 1 by formal board action following the audit findings. 4 new members had been added, people with histories and perspectives the board had never contained before. The first meeting of the restructured board ran 40 minutes longer than scheduled because there were more questions being asked and more angles being examined than the old board had been in the habit of considering. That also mattered. Whether it would continue to matter in 5 years, in 10 years, when the urgency had faded, and the original reason for the restructuring had become history rather than present fact, was a question that only time could answer. The audit findings had been published, the full report, not a summary, not a highlights version with the difficult parts contextualized into manageability. The full 112 pages available on the company's website, with a statement from Sandra acknowledging each category of findings and committing to specific changes. The response to the publication had been mixed, in the way responses to difficult truths are always mixed. Some employees were angry that it had been made public. Some were relieved. Some left because the publication confirmed things they had suspected, and they did not trust that the company would change fast enough to be worth staying for. Some who had been thinking about leaving stayed because the publication suggested a genuine attempt was being made, and they decided to give it time. Roland Vance stayed. He had thought about leaving. He had thought about it seriously for about 3 weeks in the month after the audit report was published. But he had decided to stay because leaving felt like the easier choice, and he had spent 7 years making easy choices about what he noticed and what he named and what he reported. He had decided to try a different approach. He had gone to Sandra in her first month. He had told her the things he had told Diane, about what he had noticed and not named, about what it had cost. Sandra had listened. Then she had said, "I know. I noticed the same things. I noticed them every week for 3 years." They had looked at each other. "What do we do differently?" Roland had asked. "We stop making peace with it," Sandra had said. That was all. A simple sentence. But Roland wrote it in his notebook and looked at it most mornings. Elijah had added something to his investment process. He did not announce it. He did not write about it. He simply started doing it. Before any initial meeting with the company's leadership, before any financial review or technical analysis, he had a member of his team spend 2 days at the company, not as an analyst, as a person, attending ordinary meetings, eating in the cafeteria, riding elevators, watching how people in the room were treated when they were not being observed by anyone with decision-making authority. He sent this same team member to Harwell Technologies twice in the first year. The reports came back substantively different the second time than the first. Not transformed, not solved, but different, measurably different. The kind of different that is made of small accumulating choices that nobody notices individually, and everyone notices over time. He read both reports. He filed them. He kept watching. Diane did not make a public comeback. She had been offered opportunities to. Invitations to profile pieces about her redemption arc. Requests to speak on her experience of accountability. A book agent had reached out in March. She declined all of it. Not because she had been told to, because she had sat with Elijah's words long enough to understand what they actually meant. The test is never over. You don't perform the change. You do it quietly in the rooms where nobody is recording. She kept showing up to the coaching sessions. She kept going to the organizations she had donated to. She kept reading the Harwell quarterly reports. She kept getting up at 6:30 and making coffee and sitting at her table and doing the ordinary, unspectacular, undramatic work of trying to see things she had spent 43 years not looking at. It did not feel like enough. Most days it still didn't. She went anyway. 1. Elijah Okafor still wears a plain shirt to every first meeting. He will keep wearing it because the filter still works. Because the world has not yet become the kind of place where the filter is unnecessary. Because the information it provides is still the most valuable information he can gather in a first 3 seconds, and that information still matters more to him than any number on a balance sheet. He does not describe it as a principle anymore. He has passed the stage of principle. It is simply what he does, the way his mother simply got up every morning for 3 jobs, without making it about the difficulty of it, without asking for credit for the consistency of it, just doing it because it was the right thing, and the right thing does not require an audience. He thinks about his mother most mornings, about the woman in the photograph in the lobby of the building he built, about the hands folded on the kitchen table and the eyes looking at something the camera couldn't see. He thinks he knows what she was looking at. She was looking at what was possible, not what was given. What could be built if you showed up every day knowing more than anyone expected you to know, and kept showing up, and refused to let the rooms decide what you were worth. He is still building. 2. Diane Harwell is not at the center of any room anymore. She is not sure she wants to be. This is the most surprising thing she has discovered in the year since the Grand Meridian. The certainty that she had to be at the center, the deep, built-in belief that the center was where she belonged and where she was most herself, has loosened in a way she had not anticipated and cannot fully explain. She thinks about Jerome most often. Not Elijah, Jerome, the man who held the door for 22 years. The man who said that morning was the worst morning of those 22 years. She holds that, not as a punishment, not as a sentence she is serving, as a true thing that she finally knows the weight of. A weight Jerome has carried far longer than she has, and will carry longer still. She is not the same person she was in that lobby. She is not yet the person she is trying to become. She is in the middle of that particular distance, doing the work day by day, without the cameras, without the performance in the ordinary space where real things either happen or they don't. 3. Somewhere, right now, someone is walking into a room. Plain shirt, simple shoes, no announcement of who they are. Just a person at a door extending a hand. And somewhere in that room, someone is making a decision about them in under 3 seconds, based on what they're wearing, based on where they seem to come from, based on something absorbed so deeply it doesn't even feel like a decision. This is happening right now. It happened before Elijah Okafor's lobby, and it is happening after. In hotel lobbies and conference rooms and hiring panels and coffee shops and elevators. In rooms where someone has the power to open a door and chooses to close it before the person outside has said a single word. Most of those moments will not be recorded. Most of the people absorbing them will not have a fund worth $2 billion to fly across the country and wait 3 hours in a lobby and make a phone call that changes the outcome. They will just absorb it and go home and come back tomorrow. The question this story leaves is not whether you would have shaken Elijah Okafor's hand if you had known who he was. The question is what you would have done if you didn't know. That is the only real test there is, and it is never over. I want to say something to you directly before we close. Not as a narrator, just as the person who wrote this. I create stories like this one because I believe that the stories we tell ourselves about justice matter. That the way we name what happens in lobbies and boardrooms and hiring panels and everyday rooms shapes whether we can see it when it happens and whether we decide to do something about it. But writing this story made me sit with something uncomfortable. I am not Jerome. I am not Darius. I am not employee F. I am not the 100 others whose names are not in this script and whose stories did not go viral. I have been in rooms. I have made decisions in rooms. I have made choices about who was worth my attention and who wasn't, and I have not always examined those choices as carefully as I should have. The thing that Elijah said to Diane in the 4th floor conference room stayed with me while I was writing this. The test doesn't end. You don't get to complete it and file it away and go back to operating on autopilot. It is always ongoing in the small moments and the large ones, in the rooms where someone is recording, and especially in the ones where no one is. I am still taking that test. I expect to keep failing parts of it. I am also going to keep showing up to take it, because the alternative, making peace with the way certain rooms have always been, deciding the problem, is too large to be worth the discomfort of examining myself honestly, is its own kind of choice. And it has consequences, quiet ones, the kind that don't go viral, but compound over time into a world that continues to look the way the rooms in this story looked. The engineers at Harwell Technologies built something real. It almost died in 11 weeks, not because the technology wasn't good enough, but because of decisions made in lobbies and boardrooms by people who had never been made to see how those decisions added up. Real things almost die every day for the same reason. Some of them do die. I think about that. I think about the Elijahs who never got the 3 hours in the lobby, or the sheet of paper, or the 4th floor conference room. The ones who just absorbed it and went home and never got the chapter that the world pays attention to. This story is for them too, even though they will never know it. This story was written with the assistance of artificial intelligence. The audio narration was also produced with AI voice technology. All images and video used in this production are sourced from licensed stock footage libraries. All names, characters, companies, and events depicted in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, real organizations, or actual events is purely coincidental and unintentional. This is an original work of fiction created for storytelling and inspirational purposes.